So I'm going to take you through a certain aspect of the works that I assembled for the exhibition that we had at the Metropolitan a year ago, Congo, Majesty and Power. To begin with, I want to just make the statement, put this out there, that sometimes an image of a woman is not simply a woman. Let's think about that a little bit. Artists working in many distinct cultural contexts have given original expression to extraordinary conceptions of women. These at once nurturing and formidable figures are identified with the life cycle. Such diverse visualizations mine the female body's potential for procreation as a springboard for reflecting on critical existential concerns. At their origins, such creations were conceived to enhance the well-being of their communities. The dramatic creative license that informed these depictions is often self-evident. In others, what may appear to be literal representations of conventional human interactions are far more complex. So let me give you some examples of what you are likely to have encountered in world art history surveys. To begin with, on the screen, from the 1st century AD, sculptures dedicated to the Ephesian goddess Artemis were created along the coast of modern-day Turkey. Such monuments are arresting for their colossal scale and the extrusions in the form of breasts or eggs that cover the body. Another highly charged and fantastical, larger-than-life female presence is the massive Aztec tribute to Coatlicue in Mexico City. The visage of this mother to the sun, moon, and stars, and patron of childbirth, is defined by 2 serpents. Above a torso festooned with severed bodily appendages, her lower half is wrapped in writhing snakes, and her feet are taloned. The regency of Queen Ankenes Mary II on behalf of Pepi II during the 6th dynasty of Egypt's Old Kingdom was commemorated through portraits of their relationship. Although both figures are defined as fully formed adults, they are hierarchically proportioned with the ruler seated in his mother's lap so that they face in opposing directions. And in the West, for millennia, artists such as Giotto have grappled with the majesty of the Madonna and Child, enthroned, as well as the pathos embodied in the Pietà by Michelangelo. In what for many is among the most remote and unfamiliar of places, a region that lies at the heart of the African continent, spanning areas of what are today the Republic of the Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Angola, the most gifted artists channeled their ingenuity into a sculptural genre intimate in scale. On average 12 inches in height, the surviving corpus of freestanding wood figurines depict a regal seated female figure elevated on a dais, supporting a diminutive secondary figure in her arms. These are striking for the range of formal interpretations that artists contributed to their definition, which we'll be looking at this evening. Given the dearth of contextual information documenting their original use and their relative naturalism, they have largely been interpreted as, in art historical surveys, as timeless representations of the quintessential relationship between mother and child. The creation of hundreds of such works from the mid-19th to early 20th centuries was, however, fueled by an urgent need to respond to a specific state of affairs in the life of Congo communities. Ultimately, this female-seated leader was at once a manifesto and catalyst for the idea of wealth in people. This evening, I'm going to share with you the relevant socio-cultural context out of which this form of expression emerged. And in order to do so, let's go back 4 centuries to the year 1482, which marked the convergence of Central Africa and Europe on the coast of present-day Angola for the very first time. On the left is the Portuguese monument carved from limestone in Lisbon and delivered by the navigator Diego Cao on his inaugural mission to the mouth of the Congo River. On the right is the very first work of African art sent to Europe as a diplomatic gift several decades later by the Congo sovereign Afonso I to Pope Leo X, a Medici prince. This elephant tusk represented the most precious of materials, and its surface was adorned with delicately incised spiraling bands of geometric patterns. This abstract decorative program that you can see winding around the surface of the tusk has been interpreted as a visual metaphor for indigenous notions of humankind's spiritual journey into this world and on to the next. Between the 16th and 18th centuries in this region of Central Africa, Congo princes commissioned carved ivories and woven textiles from local artists as prestige items that they sent to their counterparts across Europe, who in turn preserved them in their art cabinets or Kunstkammer. And for those of you who had the opportunity to visit us last fall, our first room of the Congo exhibition at the Metropolitan consisted with all of the examples of these early precious ivories and textiles that have survived in European princely collections. Now, these were really art for art's sake. Cloth was a measure of wealth in Congo society, and textiles that were elaborately designed were the most prized luxury good. In the early 16th century, the Portuguese sea captain and explorer Duarte Pacheco Pereira declared that Congo luxury cloths were so beautiful that those made in Italy do not surpass them in workmanship. And for a European to make that value judgment in the 16th century was quite a compliment given the caliber of the silks and velvets that Italian textile merchants were celebrated for. naturally golden-hued. They were composed from leaves of the raffia palm trees that grow in profusion in this region. So extensive was the use of this material in Congo society that the Portuguese referred to it as the land of the raffia palms. Before the 20th century, Congo peoples were organized in a number of distinct polities that were no isolated backwaters, but rather globally networked centers. The most powerful of these were the kingdoms of Luango and Congo. And on the left is an illuminated manuscript painted in Lisbon during the early 16th century that essentially is a record of the coats of arms of all the great powers of the day. And on this particular leaf, in the lower right-hand corner, is the coat of arms of the Kingdom of Congo. Its leaders back in Central Africa had described how they wanted their coat of arms to be rendered in Portugal. And on the right is a 17th century engraving from the Dutch commentator Alfred Dapper that provides a depiction of the lavish court of the King of Luango as it was described to him by many of his compatriots who were doing business in this region of Central Africa. The Kingdom of Congo's leadership elected, and that's important to note, they intentionally chose for themselves to adopt Christianity in the late 1400s. And at the same time, they embraced literacy. This is often quite surprising to those of us who aren't steeped in African history. And this is really quite an important instance of a situation where we have many, many written documents from the 15th, 16th, and 17th century that give us a sense of what was on the minds of the leadership in this region in Central Africa. The survival of correspondence between Congo leaders and their counterparts in Europe afford a rare African perspective on world affairs. These documentary sources make evident that Congo artists were exposed to Christian religious artifacts imported from the West, including crucifixes and images of Catholic saints as early as the end of the 15th century. These were initially requested by Congo leaders from their Portuguese counterparts as part of their adoption of Christianity. And actually on the screen on the right is a letter from King Afonso I, the same king who sent that ivory elephant tusk to Pope Leo X, writing to the King of Portugal, Manuel I, making this kind of request for religious paraphernalia so that he could better practice his faith. Now, the imports that came into this region from Europe were in turn locally reproduced by regional artists. And because Catholicism was an elite faith adopted by the royalty at the Congo court and a reflection of their cosmopolitanism, the Christian imagery was immediately integrated into their regalia. While none of the original European artifacts sent to Congo have survived, the reinterpretations of those original prototypes in a local vernacular have come down to us in the form of locally cast figurines that likely date from the 17th and 18th centuries. And you saw an instance of a Congo Christ, and here you see images of Saint Anthony in a Franciscan habit holding the Christ child standing on a gospel, he being an important Catholic saint favored by the Portuguese, became very important at the Congo court because the Portuguese were their main trading partner early on in the relationship with Europe. Among the most important attributes of leadership in Congo society were elaborate scepters with figurative finials. And on the left, you see a staff with St. Anthony at the summit. And here you see two other versions of scepters that were owned by Congo leaders in ivory. The one on the left shows a Congo leader enthroned, sitting above an enslaved individual, and on the right is a beautiful woman kneeling in an attitude of respect and devotion. The kind of imagery that was selected for the summit of the staves of office of Congo leaders wasn't purely decorative. It really was selected as a point of reference to reflect on the source of their authority and power. And with that in mind, it's interesting to consider that a lot of the finials for Congo leaders' scepters took the form of beautiful women, even though the leaders themselves were male. The regalia of Congo elites included fiber crowns, like the one on the left, and many of these were often, this form is hand embroidered by men, and then often there were attributes of power added to the summit in the form of leopard claws, and then this distinctive form of open work fiber cape. Soon after contact, the development of the Atlantic slave trade becomes a reality in this region of the world. It begins slowly as a way of discarding people who are prisoners of war or undesirables, but very quickly, the momentum and the demand on the European end creates a quite cataclysmic situation that generates unprecedented tragedy, and in which millions of people are uprooted forcibly from this region of Central Africa and exported to the New World. This spiraling climate of destabilization is chronicled by artists in depictions of the intense cruelty and ruthless exploitation Congo communities were subjected to in order to fuel the establishment of European empires in the Americas. This is a work that dates to the 19th century, and it's like the tusk that we saw was sent as a prestige item to the Pope at the beginning of the 16th century. This is an object that was created for export. It's a genre of sculpture that was commissioned by Europeans who brought these carved elephant tusks back home to Europe, back to their homes in Brussels, in Amsterdam, in London, as decorative objects. But you can see that the imagery that the Congo carvers covered the surfaces of these tusks with are quite subversive and hard-hitting. With the abolition of the slave trade, Europe's focus shifted to an accelerated demand for Central Africa's natural resources procured through forced labor. So even once the slave trade is abolished by European powers in the 19th century, that just marks a transition to colonization and directing local people to work to harvest resources for export to Europe. The toll exacted on local populations is described in the detailed depictions chiseled in relief around the surface of works like the one on the screen that are a painful record of the experience of people in this region. It's a little bit hard to see, but in this band that is right down from the top is a group of men who are chained to one another, who are being led to the coast to be shipped off to the New World. In Congo society, although in the Kingdom of Congo, the leadership had adopted Christianity, Catholicism, as their official faith, the traditional religions remained intact into the mid-20th century, and they were led by ritual specialists known as Enganga, or priests. The Enganga in Congo society was a power broker responsible for overseeing the development and execution of art forms that summoned forces from the spiritual realm. The Enganga did so in order to direct their intervention to address the most pressing needs of his constituents. And these ranged from healthcare issues to endemic social conflict. On the left is a mask worn by an Enganga. You can see it's very naturalistic. I mean, it appears almost to be a portrait of the wearer. And on the right is the primary instrument that he deployed in his practice, what we know as an inkisi, or power figure. This was a medicine that he prepared and that was housed in a customized vessel that often took the form of a hollowed figurative sculpture. And the example on the right that we featured in the exhibition from a museum in the Netherlands, you can actually see the cavity, the hollowed torso of the figure that was opened at some point in the 20th century and emptied, so that you see that the sculpture is really just a container or a vessel for the powerful ingredients that the priest would have gathered and added to the figure so that it would be an effective bridge with the spiritual realm. Such power figures were a target of destruction by the earliest European missionaries. We hear accounts even in the 16th century of Jesuits putting pressure on local communities to create bonfires where these were disposed of. And these are described in the early accounts of Europeans as the local idols. In the 19th century, during the period when this region was being claimed by various European powers, Belgium, Portugal, and France, thousands of these power figures were collected by traders and colonial officials for newly established ethnographic museums in Europe's capitals. Now, the most ambitious and monumental form that these power figures were to take in this region of Central Africa was a variety created to house a force without bounds, known as mangaka. Mangaka is the proper name for the force that these monumental figures were created to complement. This variety of power figure, which is close to life size, if you were able to see the exhibition at the Metropolitan, the final gallery assembled 15 of these works. The 15 most important examples that survive that today reside in museums all over the world. And one of the things that we explained in the exhibition is that this form of power figure was a response to a particular moment of crisis experienced by communities in this region. At a time of intense stress, when regional leaders were struggling to contain a European presence to the coast that was becoming increasingly aggressive and encroaching on their territorial integrity, and in an attempt to retain their self-governance, in partnership with ritual specialists, local leaders sponsored this type of state-of-the-art defensive shield that was to be effective in upholding their authority for less than a generation. Sculptors were charged with producing what was in essence a life-size figurative receptacle for the most potent force imaginable. The appropriate form for its vessel was that of a formidable and intimidating male leader, poised to enforce law and order. Once that container was completed, a priest added consecrating matter to cavities within the stomach, behind the eyes, and as a beard, so that the force invoked would be drawn within. A record of all the conflicts resolved and agreements signed over the course of the deployment of this type of figure in its original community is evident in the hundreds of iron elements added to the surface of the sculpture over time. Given that the presence of these works in Congo communities instilled in leaders, local leaders, a sense of confidence in their ability to deflect outside aggression, Europeans made it a priority to confiscate and target these kinds of works as obstacles to their domination. Now, Congo artists valiantly directed their creative energies to address urgent needs of their communities, and you saw that just now in the form of the mangaka figure. And another variety of sculpture that was a response to this same moment of crisis, when there was incredible upheaval and distress in Congo communities that were being overrun by European colonialists, is this form of quite refined and tranquil and serene female seated figure. More than any material possessions, the most precious commodity controlled by Congo leaders was their wealth in people. The major genre concerned with the welfare of Congo communities, and that embodies this concept of treasure in people. And the desire for infusions of new life are these, what we have referred to as mother and child figures. And on a different order of magnitude, in a different format, you find, here you see an X-ray we did of this female figure. They too have special cavities within the body of the sculpture into which ritual specialists inserted powerful ingredients to activate prayers for new life in the communities that commissioned these works. And in the exhibition, one of the things that we did was to create a dialectic between these female figures that are, as I said, quite intimate in scale, and the quite ferocious, almost life-size male mangaka figures, which were really coming out of the same moment of angst and stress, and being commissioned by the same patrons, essentially from the same artists. It's really important to see these as part and parcel of a whole moment in the patronage of these communities. So the female figures reflect the aspirations of Congo communities for renewal and for fortification of their membership with new life at a moment where they're very much in distress and they're ravaged, whereas the male figures are the state-of-the-art defensive shield. And just to give you a sense, these are two archetypes in world art, but another interesting example in African art history that you may have come across. Last year we also had an exhibition called Mothers and Warriors, Epic Mbembe Sculpture, that presented a very small corpus of a parallel tradition that arose along the frontier of Nigeria and Cameroon in Mbembe communities, where the heartbeat of the community were these massive ceremonial drums that were the font of communication between different communities. These instruments were played to send messages very long distances, to animate celebrations, to pay respect for departed ancestors. Any number of important events in the life of an Mbembe community was animated by the sounds emanating from playing of one of these enormous ritual drums, and at either end of the drum was a female nurturer, and on the other side, a male warrior and protector. These are the two pillars of society in this part of the world. And just to give you a sense, these Mbembe sculptures that were carved at either end of those enormous drums, slit gongs, often have survived intact, whereas the hollowed drum rotted away because it was exposed to the elements over many centuries. And local communities kept the solid freestanding sculptures that survived. And here we have a very powerful image of mother and child. These Mbembe sculptures are almost a third life size. They're on another order of scale. And you can see that their aesthetic is very much defined by the erosion of the surface of the wood that occurred over their being, as a result of their being outdoor sculptures, generation after generation exposed to the elements. And here is the counterpart to the nurturing mother, the fierce, aggressive male warrior figure. And this particular archetype of male aggression and defender of the community is actually holding the severed head of one of his enemies. But to get back to Congo and the, as I noted earlier, the incredible variety of interpretations that one finds in this depiction of the nurturing female figure in Congo art. You can see just in the juxtaposition of these two works, one of the things that's quite fascinating is that at first glance, it's a representation that definitely seems accessible and familiar. It suggests to us the depiction of an ordinary interaction between a mother and her child. In this genre, the woman's body is nude, and yet a semicircular fiber cap with incised graphic patterns, the attribute of a high-ranking leader, crowns her head. This is the same fiber cap that I mentioned earlier is part of the regalia of kingship in these communities. And then other striking features are pointed teeth that have been filed, and dense geometric designs inscribed on the skin of both her back and chest. And those are cicatrization markings, indelible incisions made into the surface of the skin as a form of beautification and a demonstration of the courage of the woman who submitted to this very painful but perfecting of her body. Okay, now, earlier I showed you the mask of the Enganga Priest, who is part of the process of the commissioning of religious sculpture in Congo society. And his face was white. White, black, and red are the color palette that Congo artists work with. And white is the color of the ancestors and the spirit world, and so the face of the priest's mask was covered with white chalk, showing that he is in dialogue with that spiritual realm of experience. Red is the color of transformation and ritual change. And you can see that the sculpture right behind me is a vivid, warm red, which reflects the addition of a camwood pigment to the surface of the carved wood sculpture. And then you can see that her crown has the addition of this white pigment. The work on the right is actually, has been stripped of all that color. Probably when the sculpture arrived in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century, its European owner cleaned it of all those distracting, colorful additions. He wanted to appreciate it as pure sculpture, but originally these works were very, very vividly colorated. While the overarching features consistently frame the female protagonist as an individual of elite status, greater creative license is evident in the definition of the secondary figure at the center of the composition that she holds in her arms. Critical scrutiny of that passage suggests that the subject at hand is not simply the depiction of a woman and her biological child. The smaller scale controlled in the seated woman's arms is a mutable cipher whose form ranges from that of a pliant newborn to a male sexual partner or even an inert adult corpse. The array of roles that this miniature secondary figure takes on induces a sense of disquiet into the formal dynamic of the female figure's exceptional influence. And a little bit hard to see, but this figure that you see right behind me, it's really just a miniature version of the woman herself. It's not, you know, an infant. It's just, it reminds me a little bit of the Egyptian sculpture that I showed you in the very beginning. Among the greatest of Congo master sculptors is an artist that we've come to know as the master of Kasadi, and two of his works, front and back, are on the screen right now. And we only know him through the regional center, where a number of his works were collected during the early 20th century. His carving style is defined by the naturalistic proportions of his figures that are, however, idealized so that, ironically, it's difficult to distinguish males from females in the repertory of his work. If you look at these two figures, unless you had the passage of the breasts, it would be a little bit difficult to determine whether this is a man or a woman. It's very sort of, you know, lacking in any nuance. His mother and child figures are also very striking for the degree of detachment between the seated woman and the figure that she holds in her arms. And this artist really lavishes attention on the dense, abstract, geometric patterns on the body. And his works are as impressive from the back as they are from the front. Because of that, the body really becomes a canvas for this really extraordinary abstraction. Now, if you look closely at the interaction between the seated woman who's looking in front of her and the miniature figure that she holds in her lap, you can see that, as I mentioned earlier, this is, not an infant that she holds in her arms, but there is a sexual gesturing that's happening on the part of the miniature male figure who lies in her arms. And just to remind you where all that beautiful abstraction on the body comes from, this is one of those Congo textiles that is preserved in a European collection that dates from the 17th century. This one is in the collection of the Pitt Rivers Museum at Oxford, and was produced in this region, has both the original golden-hued coloration and some addition of pigments, and these, in these textiles, on the ivories, on the body, the full array of Congo idioms of visual expression, regional artists took the approach of filling those surfaces with the abstract geometric conceit of an ever-expanding network of interlaced strands that encircle diamond and lozenge forms. The density of these geometric designs cover all kinds of decorative arts, and give us a sense of a coherent cultural aesthetic that we find going back to as far as the 8th century in archaeological ceramics that have been unearthed in this area. And then, of course, as I mentioned, what the artist is depicting is what actually happened in real life in terms of, women's bodies being covered with these decorative schemes. So you see a photograph from the early 20th century of women that were still undergoing those procedures. Now, a contemporary and probable rival of the master of Kasadi, who I just showed you, is this artist, the master of Boma Vonde. And he's another artist who we only know through his creative output. We know nothing about the biographies or the life stories of these particular artists. We just know that they were professionals. They worked in ateliers. They were in great demand. Individuals who had the means would commission works from them from great distances, travel, and it's quite wonderful to see two artists really at the top of their game producing in this idiom, and to see how differently they took the genre. The Master of Boma Vonde's mother and child figures, are really about the softness of the bodies of these voluptuous women that are seated in these very regal postures. The head is given greater proportional emphasis, and there's really a very graceful integration of the body of the newborn into the structure of the mother's physiognomy. And this is an instance where the artist has taken the tack that this is an infant that she holds, that she cradles, that she nurtures in her arms. Across his work, the tender nature of the interaction between the female and the figure she nurses is really striking for its fluidity. It's a very natural interplay, and the infant is enfolded in the mother's corporeal being. Now, ironically, even though these works were produced in the mid to late 19th century, really, half a century's period in time, in the relative recent past, we really have, as I mentioned earlier, very little documentation of the specifics of how they were used by their owners in these communities. But the takeaway is that they really were fulfilling a need, local prayers for intercession to rebuild communities that had been devastated by the slave trade, that were being trampled by colonial occupation, and that were really in very delicate state of being. So at either end of the Congo aesthetic spectrum are the qualities of elegance, refinement, and human perfection embodied by female subjects, such as the seated mother and child figures and this finial from a Congo sovereign's scepter. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have the imposing and aggressive male protector of Congo communities. The jewel-like miniature finial from a Congo scepter, like the seated women holding secondary figures, was intended to be seen in direct relationship to the almost life-size threatening mangaka figures. And I want to underscore this point because often in popular culture, there's an assumption that this very scary, aggressive, intimidating figure is intended to be something beautiful in the society that produced it. And that is not the case at all. It's intended to instill in the viewer a sense of awe and intimidation in the consequences for not respecting the rule of law and the sovereignty of local leaders, whereas what we're looking at on the left and in the form of those seated mother and child figures is what beauty and elegance and grace is all about. And Congo patrons, their aesthetic range was essentially not unlike our own. There's a universality to the aesthetics that you're seeing in these works, but you have to see them as part of a whole. These commanding women embodied transcendent beauty and majesty in one of Africa's major civilizations. And in direct contrast, The mangaka figures are not an aesthetic to be emulated, but rather personify the ultimate manifestation of power harnessed by Congo leaders and a force to be reckoned with. Thank you very much.